The road, if it could still be called that, ended abruptly in a churned-up patch of gravel and mud. A collegiate, the world fell away into a raging gray sea. Blake killed the engine, the sudden silence inside the battered pickup truck more jarring than the engine's persistent rattle. For a long moment, he simply stared through the rain-streaked windshield, the wipers having ceased their frantic dance. The air outside was a violent symphony of wind and crashing waves, a sound that seemed to scour the very thoughts from his mind. He'd driven for 2 days, pushing through the last vestiges of civilization, then through desolate coastal towns, until the tarmac had surrendered to this raw, unforgiving landscape. His destination, the remote lighthouse and its attached weather station, had been a distant, almost mythical entity in the job description. Now it was a stark, formidable reality. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the cold glass. The past 2 months had been a blur of frantic decisions and the gnawing ache of regret. This place, this isolated sentinel on the edge of the world, was meant to be an escape, a place where the noise of his own making couldn't reach him, where the incessant echoes of his failures might finally dissipate into the vast, indifferent ocean. But as he looked out, a different kind of noise began to rise, not external, but internal. A low hum of apprehension that vibrated through his bones. A sigh that felt heavy with the weight of unspoken burdens. Blake pushed open the truck door. The wind immediately tore at his clothes, whipping his dark hair across his face. The air was thick with the brine of the sea, sharp and cold, stinging his eyes. He pulled his worn canvas jacket tighter, hunching his shoulders against the assault. And then he saw it, truly saw it, not just as a distant silhouette, but as the monolithic structure it was. The lighthouse stood perhaps 100 yards away, perched on the highest point of a jagged, windswept promontory. It wasn't the picturesque, candy-striped tower of postcards. This was a fortress of dark, weather-beaten stone, ancient and unyielding, its walls stained with centuries of salt and spray. It rose from the rock like a petrified giant, a single, unwavering column against the tumultuous sky. At its base, a squat, rectangular building, equally grim and sturdy, formed the living quarters and the heart of the weather station. No light shone from its lantern room, a dark, vacant eye staring out at the turbulent waters. Blake shivered, a chill that had nothing to do with the biting wind. It looked less like a beacon of hope and more like a monument to endurance, or perhaps to despair. He retrieved his duffel bag from the truck bed, its weight a familiar comfort, and began the short, arduous walk. The ground underfoot was a treacherous mix of loose shale and slick, rain-soaked rock. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, a struggle that mirrored the one raging within him. The roar of the waves grew louder with each meter, a primeval rumble that threatened to swallow all other sounds. As he drew closer, the sheer scale of the lighthouse became overwhelming. The stone blocks were massive, expertly fitted, testament to a craftsmanship that defied the ravages of time. There were no windows on the main tower, only the occasional slit, like arrow loops in a medieval keep. The living quarters below, however, had a few small, deeply recessed panes, dark and uninviting. He reached a heavy, iron-bound door set into the base of the living quarters. The paint was peeling, the metal rusted in places, but it looked impregnable. A small, tarnished brass plaque, almost illegible, read, "North the Guard Station." Blake fumbled in his pocket for the heavy, antique-looking key the agency had provided. It was cold and pitted against his palm. The lock groaned in protest as he turned the key, a sound that echoed the desolation of the place. The door swung inward with a prolonged metallic shriek, revealing an interior cloaked in shadow and an immediate, profound chill. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of damp stone, salt, and something else. Something indefinable, ancient, and faintly metallic. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a long time. A place where the air itself had grown stagnant, absorbing the essence of its history. Blake stepped across the threshold, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a resounding thud that vibrated through the floor. The sound was conclusive, final. He was here, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick, pressing in on him, filled with the unseen presences of the wind outside and the unsettling quiet within. He stood in a small, cramped vestibule, the darkness ahead an open maw. He could feel the vast, empty spiral of the lighthouse tower above him. A silent, watchful presence. The overwhelming solitude was not just a concept. It was a physical weight, settling upon his shoulders, threatening to crush him. He had sought escape, but it felt as though he had merely traded one cage for another, larger, colder one, with only the sea for company. And the sea, he realized with a growing dread, offered no comfort at all. The world, as his colleague had put it, fell away into a raging abyss of sea and sky. Blake had felt it too, the abrupt severance from anything resembling civilization. Now the heavy oak door of the lighthouse groaned inward on rusted hinges, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of brine, mildew, and something else, something faintly metallic and ancient. He stepped over a raised threshold, his boots thudding on a floor of rough-hewn stone. The wind, a constant mournful wail, found purchase even within these thick walls, whispering through unseen cracks. The entrance hall was a circular antechamber, leading immediately to a spiraling iron staircase that vanished into the gloom above. A colleague motes danced in the sparse light filtering through a grimy, high-set window, illuminating a scene of profound neglect. What little furniture remained, a broken chair, a collapsed shelf, was shrouded in thick cobwebs. Blake shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. It wasn't just the cold. He began his ascent, each step on the metal treads echoing loudly in the enclosed space. The air grew heavier with every turn, pressing in on him. The lighthouse was a hollow shell, but it felt strangely alive. Breathing the very elements it had once defied. A agent what felt like an interminable climb, the stairs opened into a wider circular room. This was clearly a living quarter, perhaps even the main operational hub. A heavy wooden desk dominated one section, its surface scarred and stained, surrounded by shelves crammed with forgotten items. Blake approached the desk, his fingers tracing the deep grooves in the wood. A guard the scattered debris, a broken sextant, a tarnished brass bell, a faded map of treacherous shoals. He found them. 3 leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and brittle, their pages yellowed like old teeth. The ink on the uppermost one was faded, almost illegible in places, but the date scrawled on the first page read, October 1897. He picked up the journal, the leather flaking under his touch. It felt heavy, imbued with the weight of forgotten thoughts. A figure through, he saw dense, looping script, often marred by water stains or smudges. He caught fragments of entries. The storm howled for 3 days. The light flickered, almost gave out. Saw shapes in the mist, not of this world. Blake frowned, dismissing it as the ramblings of an isolated mind, perhaps driven to despair by the endless solitude. Yet, a prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. A purse in the journals, tucked amongst other maritime relics, lay a strange, carved piece of whalebone. It wasn't scrimshaw as he knew it, depicting whaling scenes or ships. Instead, it showed grotesque, elongated figures, their faces devoid of features, their limbs twisted into unnatural positions. They seemed to be reaching, or perhaps recoiling, from a central swirling vortex etched with unsettling precision. It was crude, yet disturbingly potent. He turned it over in his hand, a sudden, fleeting impression of eyes watching him from the bone's polished surface. He blinked, the illusion vanishing. A witness, he heard it. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a floor. It seemed to come from the far corner of the room, near a dusty old barometer. Blake froze, straining his ears. The wind outside howled, rattling the glass in the high windows, but this was distinct, softer, almost human. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast space. "Officer," the wind answered. He shook his head. A detective, much travel, too much isolation already. His mind was playing tricks. He moved to another part of the room, examining a collection of old weather charts tacked to a bulletin board, their edges curled and brittle. A specialist depicted storm fronts. Others recorded barometric pressure, all dating back decades. As he leaned closer to decipher a particularly faded entry, a shadow detached itself from the wall directly opposite him. It was fleeting, a ripple in his peripheral vision, like a cloak sweeping past an open doorway. He snapped his head up, his eyes darting to where he'd seen it. Nothing. A technician, the dim, dusty wall unbroken. His heart gave a frantic thump against his ribs. He stood perfectly still, listening. The whispers seemed to return, a little closer this time, a breath against the very edge of his hearing. Almost a name. Blake. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "All right, Blake, you're tired," he muttered aloud, running a hand through his hair. "It's the isolation. It's the old house settling." He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for the phantom whisper, the shifting shadow. He was alone here, miles from anyone. There was no one else. Yet a cold dread began to seep into his bones, a chilling doubt that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. A colleague he truly alone? Or was this place already beginning to twist his perceptions, to turn his own mind against him? He looked back at the journals, at the strange carved bone. They seemed to watch him, silent witnesses to a burgeoning unease he couldn't shake. The world, as his colleague had put it, fell away into a raging abyss of sea and sky. Blake had felt it too, the abrupt severance from anything resembling normal. The storm, a leviathan of wind and water, had swallowed the horizon whole. It wasn't just rain. It was a liquid battering ram, slamming against the thick glass of the weather station's dome, a constant deafening roar that vibrated through the very bones of the structure. The entire building groaned and shuddered under the assault, a ship adrift on a furious dark ocean. Outside, the lighthouse, a stoic sentinel, was frequently lost in the frothing chaos, its beam a futile flicker against the monumental darkness. The radio, which had been spitting static and garbled warnings, suddenly went silent. One moment, a distorted voice was advising him to hunker down. The next, only the hiss of dead air. Blake tried every frequency, every channel, twisting the dials with a growing knot in his stomach. Nothing. Just the white noise of an empty universe. He even tried the landline, a redundant anachronism rarely used, but its dial tone was also gone, replaced by a flat, lifeless drone. He was alone. Truly, utterly alone. The storm hadn't just cut off communication. It had amputated him from the world, leaving him stranded on a solitary rock in a world gone mad. He tried to busy himself, checking equipment, making notes on the barometer's frantic plummet, but his movements felt sluggish, his thoughts distant. The relentless din of the storm was a presence, a malevolent entity pressing in on him from all sides. He caught himself staring, unblinking, at the condensation streaking down the observation dome, imagining shapes in the shifting patterns. A face, gaunt and desperate, seemed to momentarily coalesce in the swirling mist before dissolving back into water. He blinked, shook his head. Just fatigue. The isolation was getting to him, playing tricks. But the tricks didn't stop. A chill, colder than the raging tempest outside, snaked up his spine. He was alone in the station, yet he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on a gust of wind inside. The sealed room. It sounded like a name, or perhaps a plea, barely audible above the storm's howl. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was nothing. A colleague, the familiar, sterile equipment, the flickering console lights. He dismissed it as the wind rattling the old structure, or perhaps the creak of settling metal. But the feeling lingered, a cold hand on his shoulder. The nights were worse. An agent became a battle he was losing. Every time he drifted off, he was plunged into a maelstrom of disturbing images. He saw the station, but it was older, grimier, lit by the sickly yellow glow of an oil lamp. A man, his face obscured by shadow, his hands trembling, desperately scribbled in a logbook, his eyes wide with a terror Blake felt in his own chest. Then, the scene would shift. A desolate cliff edge, the figure in tattered oilskins staring out at a raging sea, a profound despair radiating from him, before he simply stepped forward, into the void. Blake would wake with a gasp, drenched in sweat, the phantom chill of the sea spray still on his face. A guard weren't just dreams. They were too vivid, too immediate. They felt like memories, though not his own. He started seeing things even when awake. A fleeting shadow in his peripheral vision, a flicker of movement where there should be none. He'd turn sharply, only to find an empty corridor, the hum of the ventilation system his only companion. The whispers grew clearer, sometimes sounding like a woman weeping, sometimes a man muttering frantic, unintelligible words. He started to recognize a pattern, the faces, the despair, the sense of being trapped. They felt intimately connected to the sparse, chilling tales he'd read in the station's dusty archives, grim accounts of the lighthouse's previous keepers, a figure who had simply vanished into the sea, or gone mad, their logbooks ending abruptly in scrawled, incoherent warnings of the pull or the voices. He tried to fight it, pacing the station, reciting scientific facts, anything to ground himself in reality. But the reality was dissolving. The station, once a sanctuary of science and order, now felt like a mausoleum, echoing with unseen presences and the ghosts of forgotten despair. The storm outside was a constant, malevolent soundtrack to his unraveling, each gust a whisper, each crash of waves a distant, mournful cry. He began to feel watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes that seemed to penetrate the very walls, eyes that held the same desperate terror he saw in his waking nightmares. One evening, as the gale reached a fever pitch, rattling the very foundations of the building, Blake was trying to recalibrate a wind sensor. His hands were shaking. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the main observation window. In the swirling rain and spray, illuminated by a momentary flash of lightning, he saw it clearly. A man's face, pressed against the outside of the glass. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, fixed on Blake with an expression of abject terror and a desperate plea. His mouth was open, silently screaming, before he was ripped away by the wind, vanishing into the tempest. Blake stumbled back, gasping, his heart seizing in his chest. He clutched at the console, his knuckles white. It wasn't a trick of the light, not this time. It had been real. Or had it? The line between sanity and madness, between the storm and the horrors within, was blurring, threatening to consume him entirely. The world, as his colleague had put it, fell away into a raging abyss of sea and sky. Blake had felt it too, the abrupt severance from anything resembling solid ground. Solid thought. Now, hours later, the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence far more unsettling than its fury. The air was heavy, damp, tasting of salt and something else. A metallic tang that pricked the back of his throat. He shivered, But it wasn't from the chill seeping through the station's thick walls. It was the echo of that feeling, the sensation of being cut adrift that clawed at his insides. He found himself drawn back to the journals, a morbid, irresistible pull. The old leather-bound books lay scattered on the table, their pages brittle, their ink faded, yet each word seemed to hum with a dark, resonant energy. He picked up the nearest one, its spine cracked, dated nearly a century ago. The script began neatly, observations of barometric pressure and wind speed, typical weather station minutiae. But then, a subtle shift. The sea. It watches. A colleague watching. An innocuous enough phrase, perhaps a poetic flourish. But as Blake turned the page, the observations grew sparser, replaced by increasingly erratic scrawls. The light. It pulls. A song from below. The handwriting deteriorated, letters slanting wildly, ink smudged as if the writer's hand trembled. Graham says it's the isolation, but the agent doesn't hear it. Not yet. Blake's breath hitched. Graham. He remembered that name from an earlier entry. A relief keeper mentioned briefly before his own arrival. He flipped further, past pages filled with what looked like crude looping diagrams that made no sense, and then a series of stark, almost childish drawings of eyes staring up from shadowed depths. The final entry in that journal was a single frantic sentence, barely legible. Blake went to sea. The hum, it's glorious. And then nothing. The rest of the pages were blank. A cold dread seeped into Blake's bones. He picked up another journal, this one from a different keeper, dated 50 years later. This one started with a complaint about the previous occupant. Keeper the guard has vanished, a figure no note, no explanation, just gone. Command is baffled. Blakeham to take over immediately. Blake's eyes widened. Vanished, not transferred, not resigned, just gone. The pattern began to coalesce, chillingly clear. He sifted through more, each one a variation on the same terrifying theme. A new keeper arrives, documenting the weather, the routine. A person the subtle shift, the first mention of the sea's strange influence. The deep calls to him. One wrote, a whisper in the roar. Another. Blake, find myself drawn to the observation deck at night, staring into the black. There are shapes. The entries spoke of a growing obsession, a magnetic pull towards the ocean, not merely its surface, but its unimaginable depths. He found one journal where the keeper, a man named Henderson, had meticulously tracked his own deterioration. Day 47. The dreams have started. Water, always water, and a light far, far below. Day 62. The hum is constant now. It vibrates in his teeth. Blake can almost make out words. Day 78. Blake saw it. Just a glimpse. A vastness. It isn't empty. It's full. And it wants something. Henderson's final entry was a single defiant word, scrawled repeatedly across the page until the ink ran dry. No, 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 no. Blake felt a prickle of sweat on his scalp. This wasn't just isolation-induced madness. It was a contagion, a shared delusion, or something far worse. Each keeper, in their turn, had succumbed to the same insidious draw, the same terrifying fascination with the deep. They hadn't left. They had been taken. Or they had gone. He looked up from the journals, his gaze instinctively drawn to the thick, reinforced glass of the observation window. The sea, now calm, stretched out endlessly, a vast, dark expanse under a bruised sky. It looked deceptively placid, but Blake now saw it differently. He saw the weight of its unimaginable volume, the crushing pressure of its depths, the secrets it held. He thought of the hum, the whispers, the shapes. He thought of the abrupt severances, the disappearances, He thought of Henderson's desperate, repeated no. A cold, insidious thought slithered into his mind, wrapping around his heart like an icy tendril. He was the current keeper. He was isolated, and he was starting to feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the soles of his feet, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the station, from the abyssal darkness beneath. He was next. The deep was calling, and he was beginning to wonder if he could say no. The world, as his colleague had put it, fell away into a raging abyss of sea and sky. Blake had felt it too, the abrupt severance from anything resembling sanity, anything resembling the predictable, ordered universe he had always known. The feeling lingered, a metallic taste at the back of his throat, a dull ache behind his eyes, long after the immediate shock had subsided. He was alone in the weather station, the hum of the equipment a thin, reedy counterpoint to the roaring wind outside. He tried to tell himself it was exhaustion, the relentless isolation, the sheer ferocity of the storm. Yet, a part of him knew better. He'd been attempting to compile the latest data, fingers fumbling with the keyboard, when it started. A faint click, like a loose connection, but it wasn't the equipment. His gaze drifted to the heavy ceramic mug of stale coffee on the edge of his desk. It wasn't moving, but something felt off. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. A colleague had shifted? No, impossible. He must have nudged it himself. He turned back to the screen, forcing his attention to the fluctuating barometric pressure. A soft thump echoed from the small kitchenette area, distinct over the wind's howl. Blake froze, every muscle tensing. He wasn't expecting anyone. He hadn't heard a door open. He was alone. He called out, "Hello?" His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the station. No answer. Slowly, carefully, he rose from his chair, his boots creaking on the linoleum. He walked towards the kitchenette, peering around the doorframe. A roll of paper towels had fallen from the counter, lying innocently on the floor. He stooped to pick it up, his brow furrowed. It had been placed securely, well away from the edge. A draft? He felt none. The air was still, oppressive. As he straightened, a sudden profound chill descended, not just in the air, but seemingly within. The very space around him. It was localized, a perfect circle of Arctic breath that had materialized directly in front of the empty microwave. Blake shivered violently, a deep, bone-aching cold that defied explanation. The rest of the small room remained at its usual, slightly stuffy temperature. Yet this pocket of frigid air felt like a portal to some frozen, desolate realm. His breath plumed white in the sudden cold. He could feel the hairs on his arms standing on end, not from the chill alone, but from the primal terror that prickled his skin. He backed away slowly, his eyes wide, fixed on the shimmering, unnatural cold. It dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering sensation of dread and the scent of ozone. Blake stumbled back into the main control room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. A agent deliberate. The digital readouts on the consoles flickered, momentarily displaying garbled static before returning to normal. A pen, which he'd left lying flat on his logbook, slowly, impossibly, rolled across the smooth surface of the desk. It didn't fall. It moved with a deliberate, almost graceful momentum, stopping precisely at the edge, poised to drop. Blake watched, mesmerized and horrified. He dared not move, dared not breathe. The pen trembled there for a moment. Then, with a soft tap, it dropped to the floor. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the concrete floor, rising from the very foundations of the station. It wasn't the generators, nor the storm. This was deeper, more ancient, a sound that seemed to originate from the abyssal depths beneath the station, from the dark, churning ocean itself. It grew, a single sustained note, layered with an unsettling complexity. It was a call, unmistakable and terrifying. It wasn't just a sound heard by his ears. It resonated in his bones, vibrated in his chest, echoed in the hollows of his skull. It was a siren-like summons, beautiful in its immense power, yet utterly terrifying in its intent. It spoke of boundless cold, of crushing pressure, of forgotten things stirring in the lightless chasms. And it was meant for him. Blake felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force drawing his attention towards the reinforced windows that overlooked the tempestuous sea. The sound intensified, blossoming into a chorus of deep, mournful tones that seemed to weave his name into their ancient fabric. He staggered towards the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The storm raged, a maelstrom of white foam and black water. But through the chaos, he could almost perceive a shape, a vast, indistinct shadow shifting in the depths. The call grew louder, more insistent, a seductive, deadly promise whispered directly into the core of his being. It was beckoning him, inviting him to join the raging abyss, to plunge into the cold, dark embrace of whatever ancient thing lay waiting beneath the waves. Blake felt a terrifying, primal urge to obey, to open the door, to step out into the storm and answer the call. He was no longer just an observer. He was being summoned. Blake's heart still hammered from the phantom whisper of his name. He was not alone. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, severing any lingering pretense of scientific detachment. A colleague shared this desolate rock with him. It was malevolent, and it was here, within the very walls of the weather station. The building, once a sanctuary from the storm, now felt like a cage, its metal skin humming with an unseen predatory energy. He had to get out. But where? The sea was a maelstrom, the cliff path a treacherous, unseen descent into oblivion. His gaze fell upon the lighthouse, its beams still cutting a frantic arc through the bruised sky. It was a beacon, yes, but also a monument to isolation, a stark reminder of humanity's futile attempts to tame the wild. Yet, it was the only other structure on this godforsaken island. An agent there, amidst its solid stone walls, he would find some answer, some escape from the insidious presence that now pressed in on him. Blake grabbed his emergency kit, a flashlight, a compact first aid pouch, a few energy bars, and shrugged into his heavy-duty storm gear. The wind howled like 1,000 tormented souls, rattling the reinforced door leading to the outside platform. He took a deep breath, the metallic tang of fear thick in his mouth, and unlatched the heavy bolts. The moment the door cracked open, the storm seized it, ripping it from his grasp with a violent shriek. Rain, sharp as needles, lashed his face, blinding him instantly. He fought to pull the door back, to shield himself from the gale force assault, but it was like wrestling a leviathan. He managed to force it shut, the heavy clang echoing through the station, leaving him breathless and soaked. He stood there, shivering, not just from the cold, but from a profound sense of despair. It was impossible. The wind was too strong, the rain too fierce. Even if he could brave the elements, the short, winding path from the station to the cliff edge, then the precarious descent to the lower reaches of the island where the lighthouse stood would be suicidal. The path would be slick with rain, possibly already eroded by the relentless waves crashing against the rock face below. A low, guttural growl seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath his feet. It wasn't the wind. It was too deep, too resonant. It felt like it came from inside the station, from the very core of the building. Blake whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom of the main living area. Nothing. A guard, the shadows dancing in the periphery, mimicking movement. Then, a whisper, clearer this time, slithering into his ear as if someone stood directly behind him. No! Escape! Blake stumbled back, heart leaping into his throat. He spun again, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly. The words had been distinct, cold, and utterly terrifying. He pressed himself against the metal wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. His breath hitched in his chest. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The temperature plummeted, and a frigid gust of wind seemed to sweep through. The sealed building, rustling papers on a desk. He could see his breath, a white plume in the sudden cold. You belong here. The voice was a chorus now, a cacophony of whispers, hissing and snarling, echoing from every corner of the room, yet seeming to emanate from nowhere at all. It was distorted, multifaceted, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, each one a different texture of malevolence. He clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to block out the horrific symphony. But it was no use. The words, the taunts, seemed to burrow directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Trapped, alone, his. He forced his eyes open, scanning the room desperately. His gaze fell upon the large window overlooking the cliff face. A figure the sheeting rain, he could just make out the faint, swirling outline of a fog, dense and unnatural, rising from the churning sea below. It wasn't just a storm. It was an impenetrable wall, a living, breathing entity that had swallowed the island whole. Even the lighthouse beam, once a frantic pulse, now seemed muffled, struggling to penetrate the gray, suffocating shroud. The path to the lighthouse, his only desperate hope, was gone. A person by the storm, yes, but also by this burgeoning, sentient mist. He felt it, a cold, oppressive weight pressing against the glass, pushing inward. It was not just a weather phenomenon. It was an extension of whatever tormented him. The growl returned, deeper, more satisfied. Nowhere. To run. Blake sank to the floor, his legs giving way beneath him. The cold seeped into his bones, and the whispers crawled under his skin. The weather station was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb. And he, its sole occupant, was now its prisoner. The lighthouse, a mere phantom in the suffocating fog, stood as a cruel monument to his absolute, inescapable despair. He was trapped, and whatever was here with him, it was just beginning to play its game. Blake's heart still hammered from the phantom whisper of his name. He was not alone. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, severing any lingering pretense of rational investigation. This was something else entirely, something primal and malevolent. The weather station, a small, square refuge from the tempest outside, suddenly felt as vulnerable as a matchbox in a hurricane. He needed answers, and the lighthouse, for all its secrets, hadn't given them all up. A colleague, its forgotten cousin, this isolated outpost, held the missing pieces. He moved methodically, his senses heightened, every creak of the old timbers a potential warning. The station was sparse. A single cot, a worn wooden table, a shelf of antiquated instruments. Barometers, anemometers, a dusty old radio. He ran his hands along the walls, searching for anything out of place. His fingers brushed against a loose board near the base of the cot. It wasn't completely flush with the others. A grunt, he pried it open. Aguard it, tucked into a narrow, dark cavity, was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained, its pages brittle with age. It wasn't a logbook for weather observations. This was different. This was personal. Blake pulled it out, the faint smell of mildew and decay rising from its pages. The handwriting was cramped, almost frantic in places, spanning decades. He found dates that predated the official lighthouse records he'd seen. The early entries were mundane enough. Observations of the sea, the sky, the loneliness. But then, a shift, The figure stirs. A person the currents, not the storm. Something older. Blake's breath hitched. He turned pages, his eyes scanning for keywords, for patterns. He found references to the site, the pact, the cycle. The author, an early keeper, detailed how the lighthouse was not merely constructed to guide ships, but built precisely on this barren outcrop, on the ruins of something far older. A witness pre-human. They chose this place not for its elevation, but for what lies beneath. A scar on the earth, where the abyssal darkness bleeds into the rock. It was here before the first man charted the stars, before the sea carved the coast. The words chilled Blake to the bone. The lighthouse was a cage, or perhaps an altar. The journal spoke of an elder being, never named, never fully described, only hinted at through its effects. A presence from the deepest, lightless chasms of the ocean, a primal entity that predated life as they knew it. It wasn't a god, not in the way men conceived of such things, but an ancient, elemental force of hunger and oblivion. An officer influence seeped into the very stone, into the very air. The light. It is not for ships. It is for it. A beacon, yes, but not to guide away, to hold, to appease. The rhythm, the pulse, it keeps the waking dream at bay. Blake's mind reeled. The steady, hypnotic sweep of the light, the mournful blare of the foghorn. They weren't just practical signals. They were rituals. A constant vigil, a desperate act of containment against something unspeakable that waited in the crushing darkness below. A detective came the most horrifying revelation. The keepers. They weren't just isolated men driven mad by solitude. They were unwilling participants in a grim, unending cycle. The specialist demands, when one breaks, another must stand. The sacrifice is not always blood, but sanity, life, presence. The entity feeds on the vigilance, on the fear, on the living anchor that holds it to its prison. When a keeper falls, the hunger grows. A technician must take his place, or the barrier weakens. The colleague begins anew. The journal entries grew increasingly desperate, the handwriting more jagged, more erratic. An agent of visions, whispers, the crushing weight of an unseen presence. A guard trying to escape, only to be drawn back by an irresistible pull or found dead, their faces contorted in silent screams. Each death wasn't just a tragedy, it was an offering, a reset button, buying precious time before the entity's full wrath was unleashed. Blake hear it now, a vast, echoing emptiness in the deep. It calls. It knows Blake am here. It knows they are all here, and soon, it will know you. The final entry was a single sprawling word, scrawled across the last page, barely legible. His. Blake dropped the journal as if it were burning him. The whisper from earlier, the cold breath on his neck, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a ghost. It was it. The figure being. It had known he was coming. It had been waiting. He wasn't just investigating a series of tragedies. He had walked straight into the heart of the trap. The lighthouse, the island, this weather station, they were all part of a vast, ancient prison, and he, Blake, was now the newest, unwitting keeper. The previous keepers hadn't been victims in the conventional sense. They were the bait, the wardens, the sacrifices. And now, he was one of them. The true horror wasn't just the entity, but his place within its ancient, terrible design. He was not alone, and that was the most terrifying truth of all. He was never meant to leave. Blake's heart still hammered from the phantom whisper of his name. He was not alone. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, severing any lingering pretense of solitude. Now the silence of the weather station didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, like a vast, unseen observer breathing down his neck. A chill, far deeper than the station's failing heating, permeated his bones, settling in the marrow. The air in the control room grew heavy, not with moisture or static, but with an invisible, crushing pressure. It wasn't just the room. It was inside his head, a tightening band around his skull. The hum of the generator, usually a comforting drone, now seemed to vibrate with an unnatural frequency, a low thrum that echoed the growing dread in his chest. Every shadow deepened. Every creak of the old structure sounded like a deliberate step. Blake gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white, trying to anchor himself to the familiar, if desolate, reality around him. A colleague, it began. A agent, a sound, not a sight, but an invasion. A presence, immense and ancient, flooded his consciousness. It wasn't a form or a shape, but a volume. A vast, cold intellect that filled every corner of his mind, pushing against the fragile walls of his sanity. He felt himself shrinking, his own thoughts becoming tiny, insignificant motes in a boundless ocean of alien awareness. The world outside, the storm, the station, even his own body seemed to recede, becoming distant and irrelevant. A guard that existed was it, and his terrified, struggling mind. It was not a voice, but a cascade of understanding directly imprinted onto his soul. You are afraid. You are alone. You are small. The words were not in English or any language he knew, yet their meaning was perfectly clear, devastatingly precise. They were truths, amplified 1,000-fold, twisted into weapons. His deepest insecurities, his most primal fears, were laid bare, not judged, but simply known, with an indifferent, crushing certainty. Blake gasped, a raw, desperate sound that was lost in the mental deluge. He clutched his head, as if he could physically push back against the psychic intrusion. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, overwhelming force pressing in. He wanted to scream, but his throat was locked, his lungs refusing to obey. This was not a physical attack. It was far worse, a dissection of his very being, a dismantling of his self from the inside out. He felt like a single candle flame against an infinite blackness, flickering, threatening to extinguish. Then, a shift. The crushing weight lessened, replaced by a chillingly seductive warmth. The vast presence didn't recede, but enfolded him, a boundless embrace that promised an end to his terror. Release, it whispered, a thought like cool water on a burning mind. Let go. A figure the struggle. There is peace here, in the joining. Visions, not seen but felt, flickered through his mind, not of grotesque horrors, but of profound tranquility. A silence deeper than any he had ever known, an absence of fear, of doubt, of loneliness. It showed him an end to the gnawing emptiness that had plagued him since his arrival, an end to the constant battle against the elements and himself. He felt the phantom touch of companionship, not from another person, but from the entity itself, a vast knowing presence that would fill every void. No more cold, no more fear, only quiet understanding, only belonging. But the price was implicit, woven into the fabric of the offer. This belonging felt like dissolution. This peace, like annihilation. He would cease to be Blake. He would become a part of it, an echo in its vast, cold consciousness. His memories, his identity, his very soul. All would be absorbed, repurposed, erased. The solace offered was the death of self, a promise of eternal peace purchased with the entirety of his existence. A sliver of defiance sparked within him, a tiny ember against the engulfing void. No, he thought, a desperate, silent scream that felt impossibly weak against the entity's might. He remembered the faint, almost forgotten warmth of human connection, the simple act of choosing his own path, however bleak. He remembered the stubborn will to survive, even when survival seemed pointless. He remembered the quiet dignity of simply being. The entity pulsed, a cold curiosity. Why resist? What is left to hold on to? Your life is a solitary vigil. Your future, only more of the same. Come, be complete, end the suffering, end the loneliness. Blake gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he pressed them against his temples. He forced his eyes open, trying to anchor himself to the grimy reality of the control room. The flickering screens, the dusty console, the storm raging outside. These were real. He was real. And he would not give himself up, not to this insidious promise of oblivion masquerading as peace. He would not surrender the last vestiges of his self, no matter how appealing the release. The battle raged within his mind, a silent, desperate war between his crumbling will and the boundless, seductive power of the entity. He felt his edges fraying, his grip on his own identity weakening. The temptation was immense, the promise of an end to suffering almost unbearable. But somewhere, deep down, a core of him still screamed defiance. He was Blake, and he would fight. Blake's heart still hammered from the phantom whisper of his name. He was not alone. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, severing any lingering pretense of his sanity, of his isolation. It was here, in the weather station, or its influence had become so potent that the very air hummed with its malevolence. There was no escape. A colleague was futile. The island was a cage, and the entity, his jailer. He had to sever its hold, or die trying. An agent by a desperation that tasted like ash and fear, Blake scoured the weather station. A guard for an exit, but for an answer. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a deliberate taunt. He tore through old logbooks, rifled through dusty supply cabinets, his hands trembling as he searched for anything. A forgotten map, a cryptic warning, a lost solution. His fingers brushed against a loose panel behind a bank of archaic communication equipment, a relic from the station's earliest days. It wasn't obvious, designed to blend perfectly with the aged wood. He pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled amongst dried, brittle sea kelp that crackled like old bones, lay not a book, but a series of thin, rectangular plates, each crafted from a dark, unfamiliar metal. They were etched with intricate, unsettling symbols that seemed to writhe under the dim light, and bound together by a single, tightly braided strand of what felt disturbingly like human hair. This was no ordinary log. This was something else entirely. He carefully lifted the plates. The chill radiating from them was profound, an icy counterpoint to the oppressive, humid air. The last plate contained a detailed diagram, a complex web of interconnected symbols, and a series of instructions scrawled in a faded, blood-red ink. The language was archaic, almost indecipherable, but key words stood out like jagged teeth. Binding, locus, severance, and most chillingly, the soul's tether. The instructions spoke of drawing the entity's pervasive influence, its tendrils reaching out from the lighthouse into a contained space, a psychic crucible. Then a profound sacrifice was required to shatter its hold, to tear it from its mooring. Blake understood with a chilling certainty that the weather station, with its instruments designed to measure and channel unseen forces, was to be that crucible. As he began to gather the necessary components, a copper wire from an old antenna, a bowl of stagnant rainwater he found outside, and the strange metallic plates, the atmosphere in the station shifted. The lights flickered, not randomly, but with a deliberate pulse, mirroring the frantic beat of his own heart. The wind outside roared, yet inside, A low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest. The whispers returned, no longer phantom, but a tangible presence. They slithered around him, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some mocking, some promising unimaginable power if he would just stop. Blake ignored them, his jaw set, his hands moving with a grim purpose. He arranged the plates in a circle on the floor, following the diagram's precise instructions. He stretched the copper wire, forming a conduit between them, and poured the dark, oily rainwater into the center of the circle. The entity raged. The station groaned as if under immense pressure. A figure rattled, glass shattered in distant rooms, and the hum intensified, threatening to tear his eardrums. A person writhed in the corners, coalescing into indistinct, monstrous shapes that seemed to reach for him. He felt a profound sense of despair trying to claw its way into his mind, whispering of futility, of inevitable doom. He knelt, his gaze fixed on the final, most crucial instruction on the plate. The soul's tether. It demanded a profound personal sacrifice. Not of blood, but of essence. To become the conduit, the mirror, the lure. To open himself completely, allowing the entity's tendrils to momentarily entwine with his own being, only to then rip them free, severing the connection at the cost of his own identity. It was worse than death. It was the obliteration of self. Blake closed his eyes, taking a shuddering breath. He knew what he had to do. With a trembling hand, he picked up a shard of broken glass from the floor. He didn't cut his skin. Instead, he pressed the edge against his temple, focusing not on physical pain, but on the deeper wound he was about to inflict. He concentrated, pouring his will, his memories, his very sense of Blake into the circle. He imagined himself as an empty vessel, a hollow shell, ready to draw in the encroaching darkness. The moment he opened himself, a cold, searing fire erupted within him. It was as if 1,000 needles pierced his mind, each one a memory, a feeling, a piece of who he was. He saw flashes of his past, his life, his hopes, all being ripped away, consumed by an insatiable void. The entity surged, its presence overwhelming, pouring into the psychic crucible he had created, into him. He felt its ancient malice, its hunger, its boundless despair. He was momentarily it, a vast, formless malevolence. With a primal scream that tore from his throat, not his own voice but a chorus of agony and defiance, Blake forced the energy of the ritual. The copper wire glowed with an eerie blue light. The symbols on the plates pulsed with a furious red. The water in the bowl boiled, churning violently. The entire weather station bucked and swayed as if caught in an earthquake, yet the source was not geological, but metaphysical. He focused all his remaining will, pouring the last vestiges of his self into the act of severance. The connection between the lighthouse and the weather station, the entity's pervasive hold, was being stretched, thinned, torn. He felt a tearing sensation within his own being, a profound, agonizing emptiness where his identity had once resided. The entity roared, a sound that seemed to originate from the very fabric of reality, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and pain. Then, with a final, blinding flash of light that erupted from the circle and a sound like tearing metal, the entity's scream was abruptly cut short. The hum died. The shadows retreated, dissolving into nothingness. The lights in the station flickered once more, then settled into a steady, if dim, glow. Blake collapsed, his body racked with tremors, his mind a vast, echoing void. He lay amidst the strange, glowing plates, his eyes open but seeing nothing. The ultimate sacrifice had been made. The hold was severed. But who or what remained? Blake's heart still hammered from the phantom whisper of his name. He was not alone. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, severing any lingering pretense of safety. He sat hunched in the weather station's observation room, the glass panes rattling softly against the incessant wind, a sound that usually lulled him but now grated on his frayed nerves. Outside, the world was a bruised canvas of pre-dawn gray, the ocean a churning expanse of black ink. The immediate threat, whatever monstrous hunger had clawed its way from the depths, felt absent. Not gone, never truly gone, but withdrawn. He'd stumbled here, a broken man seeking refuge in the familiar sterile order of scientific instruments after the chaos at the lighthouse. His clothes were stiff with dried salt and something else, something metallic and briny that clung to his skin like a second shadow. Every muscle ached, not just from exertion, but from the raw, visceral terror that had wrung him out like a dishcloth. He'd seen things that defied comprehension, felt a cold, ancient intelligence that had reached for his very soul. He'd survived, but the word felt hollow, like a bell with a cracked clapper. The weather station, usually a sanctuary of logic and data, now felt like a fragile shell against an unfathomable reality. The anemometer spun its delicate dance on the roof, oblivious to the monstrous currents that truly governed this coast. The barometric pressure held steady, a lie in the face of the crushing weight that pressed down on Blake's spirit. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the gauntness of his cheekbones. His eyes, he knew, were wide and bloodshot, reflecting a permanent state of hypervigilance. A colleague was a forgotten luxury, replaced by fitful, nightmare-ridden moments where the whisper returned, clearer, closer. He looked out towards the distant silhouette of the lighthouse, a jagged tooth against the bruised sky. It stood miraculously, still defiant, though he knew its core had been violated. An agent ran down its stone flanks, not just from the storm, but from the impossible pressure, the unnatural force that had sought to reclaim it. It was a monument now, not just to maritime history, but to his own harrowing, unspeakable encounter. He had saved it, in a way, or at least driven back the immediate onslaught. But at what cost? The memory of the thing was a barbed hook in his mind, not a creature with definable limbs or a discernible form, but a shifting, colossal presence of cold, crushing dark, an intelligence that predated humanity, an appetite that spanned eons. He'd seen its true face, or rather, felt its true nature. An entity born of primordial chaos, dwelling in the crushing abyssal plains stirred by the lighthouse's beam, by the very presence of life above. He had, in his ignorance, stumbled upon something that should have remained undisturbed, a secret best left buried in the suffocating darkness of the deep. Blake now knew. He carried the knowledge like a toxic burden. The ocean, once a source of wonder and calm, was now a vast, living tomb. Aguard the waves, beyond the reach of light, lay not just geological formations and marine life, but an incomprehensible vastness teeming with horrors that defied human understanding. The casual beauty of the surface was a thin, shimmering veil over an abyss of silent, ancient malevolence. This was his legacy, the understanding that humanity was but a fleeting flicker on the surface of a world ruled by unseen, unspeakable things. The immediate threat was gone for now. He'd seen it recede, felt the oppressive weight lift, heard the final, guttural sigh of something impossibly ancient retreating into the crushing depths. But the question clawed at him, a relentless tormentor. The figure it truly gone, or merely dormant? Sleeping, waiting. The ocean was patient. It had all the time in the world, and Blake now had all the fear. He was a survivor, yes, but also a sentinel, forever listening to the whisper of the waves, forever haunted by the knowledge of what truly lay beneath. The wind howled, carrying the scent of salt and the faintest, almost imperceptible echo of his name. He was not alone. He would never be alone again.